and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Jericho, and our guest today is Dr. Timothy Slaper. Now, Dr. Slaper attained his doctorate in economics from the American University and currently serves as the Director of Economic Analysis at the Indiana Business Research Center, or IBRC, a vital working unit within Indiana University Kelley School of Business. Now, Dr. Slaper and his team closely examines and researches vast regional and global economic trends and structures, from industry and workforce analysis, economic impact studies, to trade and foreign investment studies and economic growth measurements. Now, prior to the IBRC, he served as senior economist on the Joint Economic Committee of Congress, investigating various topics, including the effect of high energy prices on economic output and the effectiveness of investment incentives in encouraging economic growth. Now, as we approach the end of 2015, many are curious about next year's economic projections. IBRC's recent forecast for the state of Indiana and the U.S. doesn't appear to be too rosy, and Dr. Slaper will give us his reasons why and what Americans should expect next year. So, Dr. Slaper, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, it's obviously already December, and like I mentioned before in the intro, there are a lot of speculations being thrown out for next year, and IBRC recently went ahead and published their economic forecast or outlook for next year, and doesn't seem too positive. Could you give us a quick recap of these evaluations and projections?
Well, keep in mind that Indiana is going to follow the nation in many respects. So the economic outlook for the nation as a whole is not all that rosy. And one of the reasons for that is we thought we were doing better than we were actually doing. This last summer, the Bureau of Economic Analysis revised their data for the national output, and it came in lower. So it kind of, when that new data interacts within the model and changes all the coefficients, what happens is everything gets, ratcheted down a few rungs. So what we're looking at is probably the same kind of slow crawl that we've had for the last several years. So if you consider the fact that it's not any worse, maybe it's optimistic. So it all depends on your perspective. But I would say that we're probably looking at about 2% growth next year for the state. Maybe a little bit more than the national average, just because of the very strong auto sector sales that we expect to continue through next year. So it's not really rosy. It's below trend, but it's not a disaster.
Well, the U.S. hasn't, like you mentioned, been hitting an impressive economic growth percentage annually for quite some time. And there are pundits saying, coupled with the slow Chinese economic growth, that things are, like you said, a bit more difficult than expected. Now, what do you think are some of the definite industries that you think would be most negatively affected next year because of this trend?
Well, are you speaking in terms of the BRIC countries? That would be Brazil and Russia and India as well as China. If you look at that, it's the state as a whole does not trade very much with Russia or with India. We have more trade with Colombia as a country than we do with Russia. But Brazil and China have been large markets and growing markets, but the Brazilian economy is tanking. They're expected to have negative growth next year. And China, as you mentioned, is slowing down, and that means that industrial machinery is probably going to be taking a slight hit. Fairly recently, Cummins noted that they were going to be ratcheting back in some of their employment. And that means because China's not growing, there was a construction boom, and that's kind of tapering off. Those items that would be needed for construction, heavy equipment, some transportation equipment, are just not going to be as robust as they have been.
Well, obviously, experts and businesses, with the official signing of the Trans-Pacific Partnership this year, are hoping that this would kind of grease up the slower growth starting next year and years beyond. Now, what is your opinion on TPP and how it'll affect?
I wouldn't expect any big boom in terms of acceleration. These sort of, people that are trying to sell to, whether it's Korea or whether it's Thailand. They're going to go to conventions. They're going to meet there. They're going to try and sell their products, their manufactured goods. It's going to take time for them to work out the supply chains that are related to that. So I wouldn't expect a huge uptick. What might be more interesting would be, say, agricultural products, the degree to which our agricultural products would be able to gain entry into many of these countries. Because China is a huge market for, say, Indiana soybeans. Would that also be the case for other Trans-Pacific countries? We might see a boost in agricultural sales, which would be obviously good for Hoosier farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. And staying on the Hoosier topic, the center recently published their most recent publication about the 2016 economic outlook, and also finished the statewide tour, meeting with Hoosier state businesses and entrepreneurs. Now, I'm curious, what were their reactions or responses to these projections, and what do you think they're trying to strategize in order to not be too affected by the lower than expected growth?
Well, that's difficult to really assess, because when you kind of sit down with them, I typically ask them, what's their biggest problem? And sure, they don't like the policy uncertainties of whether it's government shutdowns or whether it's the Frank Dodd legislation, whether it's Obamacare, all these various influences that are pulling them, because Obamacare really cuts into their planning once they hit 50 employees. So the thing that they're more concerned about is workforce development. I mean, things that aren't necessarily next year, but the fact that we have difficulties in terms of finding good people that, they'll say, all I want is somebody that'll show up on time and will pass the drug test. I'll train them, but they need to have a decent work ethic, and they need to have, consistency in terms of being clean. So that's kind of on their number one list of concerns. And then you start talking to them more and more and more about perhaps particular skills, and they might say, well, sure, it'd be great to have people that are a little more technically savvy. But at the end of the day, they are looking out, and they're not seeing the kind of workforce that they would like to see for their future.
And finally, I feel like our conversation hasn't been too positive. We have a lot of low numbers that we hoped we would see as rise, but I guess despite the modest outlook for next year, what do you think are some definite industries in America, not only just for the state of Indiana, but U.S. as a whole, that could possibly see some positive opportunities through this, lower than projected numbers?
Well, that is a difficult question to answer, because Europe is in the doldrums as well, and we've been talking about a general slowdown across the board globally. So the question then is related to where do we have a competitive advantage? And those are the industries that we tend to do pretty well with. When you look at the number of jobs that are associated with manufacturing, you'll actually see that it's been declining over time, even while our exports are growing. That's because we have, industries that are higher value added, that are more differentiated, that are not commodities. So in terms of rolled steel, that's a commodity. Specialized pumps, specialized surfaces, nanotechnology, things like that. Things that go into planes, aerospace. Very, very highly technical, not commodities, very much differentiated. Those are the sort of products that we're able to sell. So I couldn't tell you, there's going to be this one industry that's going to be doing great and the rest are going to be lagging behind. Probably be certain slices of each industry where we have a particular competitive advantage.
Wonderful. Dr. Slaper, thank you so much for giving us your time and coming in to speak with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us. That's all for this edition of Cyber Focus. If you have any comments or suggestions for other future topics, don't forget to contact us at cyber, that's CIBER, @indiana.edu.